friends. Welcome back to the Joyful House. My name is Cynthia with Cynthia's Joyful Creations, and I am happy to be here with you today as we embark on our storybook adventure as we continue reading Anne of Avonlea. Today we are going to be reading chapter 24, A Prophet in His Own Country, and chapter 25, An Avonlea Scandal. All right, if you will just sit back and enjoy this reading adventure. A Prophet in His Own Country. One May day, Avonlea folks were mildly excited over some Avonlea notes. Signed Observer, which appeared in the Charlottetown Daily Enterprise. Gossip ascribed the authorship, therefore, to Charlie Sloane, partly because the said Charlie had indulged in similar literary flights in times past, and partly because one of the notes seemed to embody a sneer at Gilbert Blythe. Avonlea Junior Society persisted in regarding Gilbert Blythe and Charlie Sloane as rivals in the good graces of a certain damsel with gray eyes and an imagination. Gossip, as usual, was wrong. Gilbert Blythe, aided and abetted by Anne, had written the notes, putting in the one about himself as a blind. Only two of the notes had any bearing on this history. Rumor has it that there will be a wedding in our village ere the daisies are in bloom. A new and highly respected citizen will lead to the hymeneal altar one of our most popular ladies. Uncle Abe, our well-known weather prophet, predicts a violent storm of thunder and lightning for the evening of the 23rd of May, beginning at 7 o'clock sharp. The area of the storm will extend over the great part of the province. People traveling that evening will do well to take umbrellas and mackintoshes with them. Uncle Abe really has predicted a storm for some time this spring, said Gilbert. But do you suppose Mr. Harrison really does go to see Isabella Andrews? No, said Anne, laughing. I'm sure he only goes to play checkers with Mr. Harmon Andrews, but Mrs. Lynde says she knows Isabella Andrews must be going to get married. She is in such good spirits this spring. Poor old Uncle Abe felt rather indignant over the notes. He suspected that Observer was making fun of him. He angrily denied having assigned any particular date for his storm, but nobody believed him. Life in Avonlea continued on the smooth and even tenor of its way. The planting was put in, the improvers celebrated an Arbor Day, and each improver set out, or caused to be set out, 5 ornamental trees. As the society now numbered 40 members, this meant a total of 200 young trees. Early oats greened over the red fields, apple orchards flung great blossoming arms about the farmhouses, and the Snow Queen adorned itself as a bride for her husband. Anne liked to sleep with her window open and let the cherry fragrance blow over her face all night. She thought it was very poetical. Marilla thought she was risking her life. Thanksgiving should be celebrated in the spring, said Anne one evening to Marilla as they sat on the front steps and listened to the silver-sweet chorus of the frogs. I think it would be ever so much better than having it in November when everything is dead or asleep. Then you have to remember to be thankful, but in May one simply can't help but being thankful that they are alive, if for nothing else. I feel exactly as Eve must have felt in the Garden of Eden before the trouble began. Is that grass in the hollow green or golden? It seems to me, Marilla, that a pearl of the day like this, when the blossoms are out and the winds don't know where to blow from next for sheer crazy delight, must be pretty near as good as heaven. Marilla looked scandalized and glanced apprehensively around to make sure the twins were not within earshot. They came around the corner of the house just then. Ain't it an awful nice smelling evening? Asked Davy, sniffling delightedly as he swung a hoe in his grimy hands. He had been working in his garden. That spring, Marilla, by way of turning Davy's passion for raveling in mud and clay into useful channels, had given him and Dora a small plot of ground for a garden. Both had eagerly gone to work in a characteristic fashion. Dora planted, weeded, and watered carefully, systematically, and dispassionately. As a result, her plot was already green with prim, orderly little rows of vegetables and annuals. Davy, however, worked with more zeal than discretion, and he dug and hoed and raked and watered and transplanted so energetically that his seeds had no chance for their lives. "How is your garden coming on, Davy boy?" asked Anne. "Kind of slow," said Davy with a sigh. "I don't know why the things don't grow better. Milty Boulter says I must have planted them in the dark of the moon, and that's the whole trouble. He says you must never sow seeds or kill pork or cut your hair or do anything important in the wrong time of the moon. Is that true, Anne? I want to know." "Maybe if you didn't pull your plants up by the roots every day to see how they're getting on at the other end, they'd do better," said Marilla sarcastically. "I only pulled up 6 of them," protested Davy. "I wanted to see if there were grubs at the roots. Milty Boulter said if this wasn't the moon's fault, it must be grubs. But I only found 1 grub. He was a great big, juicy, curly grub. I put him on the stone and got another stone, and I smashed him flat. He made a jolly squash. I tell you, I was sorry there wasn't more of them. Dora's garden was planted same time as mine, and her things are growing all right. It can't be the moon," Davy concluded in a reflective tone. "Marilla, look at that apple tree," said Anne. "Why, the thing is human. It is reaching out long arms to pick its own pink skirts daintily up and provoke us to admiration." "Those yellow Duchess trees always bear well," said Marilla complacently. "That tree'll be loaded this year. I'm real glad. They'll be great for pies." But neither Marilla nor Anne nor anybody else was fated to make pies out of yellow Duchess apples that year. The 23rd of May came, and an unseasonably warm day, as none realized more keenly than Anne and her little beehive of pupils, sweltering over fractions and syntax in the Avonlea schoolroom. A hot breeze blew all the forenoon. But after noon hour it died away into a heavy stillness. At 3:30, Anne heard a low rumble of thunder. She promptly dismissed school at once so the children might get home before the storm came. As they went out to the playground, Anne perceived a certain shadow and gloom over the world in spite of the fact that the sun was still shining brightly. Annetta Bell caught her hand nervously. Oh, teacher, look at that awful cloud." Anne looked and gave an exclamation of dismay. In the northwest, a mass of clouds such as she had never in all her life before beheld was rapidly rolling up. It was dead black, save where it curled and fringe edges showed a ghastly, livid white. There was something about it indescribably menacing as it gloomed up in the clear blue sky. Now and then a bolt of lightning shot across it, followed by a savage growl. It hung so low that it almost seemed to be touching the tops of the wooded hills. Mr. Harmon Andrews came chattering up the hill in his truck wagon, urging his team of grays to their utmost speed. He pulled them to a halt opposite the school. "Guess Uncle Abe's hit it for once in his life, Anne," he shouted. "His storm's a-comin' a little ahead of time. Did you ever see the like of that cloud? Here, all you young ones that are going my way, pile in, and those that ain't, scoot for the post office if you're more'n a quarter of a mile to go, and stay there till the shower's over." Anne caught Davy and Dora by the hands and flew down the hill along the birch path and past Violet Vale and Willowmere as fast as the twins' fat legs could go. They reached Green Gables not a moment too soon and were joined at the door by Marilla, who had been hustling her ducks and chickens under shelter. As they dashed into the kitchen, the light seemed to vanish as if blown out by some mighty breath. The awful cloud rolled over the sun, and a darkness as of late twilight fell across the world. At the same moment, with a crash of thunder and a blinding glare of lightning, the hail swooped down and blotted the landscape out in one white fury. Through all the clamor of the storm came the thud of torn branches striking the house and the sharp cracks of breaking glass. In 3 minutes every pane in the west and north windows were broken, and the hail poured in through the apertures, covering the floor with stones, the smallest of which was as big as a hen's egg. For 3/4 of an hour, the storm raged unabated, and no one who underwent it ever forgot it. Marilla, for once in her life shaken out of her composure by sheer terror, knelt by her rocking chair in a corner of the kitchen, gasping and sobbing between the deafening thunder peals. Anne, white as paper, had dragged the sofa away from the window and sat on it with a twin on either side. Davy, at the first crash, had howled, "Anne, Anne, is it the Judgment Day? Anne, Anne, I never meant to be naughty," and then had buried his face in Anne's lap and kept it there, his little body quivering. Dora, somewhat pale but quite composed, sat with her hand clasped in Anne's, quiet and motionless. It is doubtful if an earthquake would have ever disturbed Dora. Then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the storm ceased. The hail stopped, the thunder rolled and muttered away to the eastward, and the sun burst out merry and radiant over a world so changed that it seemed an absurd thing to think that at a scant 3/4 of an hour could have effected such a transformation. Marilla rose from her knees, weak and trembling, and dropped on her rocker. Her face was haggard, and she looked 10 years older. "Have we all come out of that alive?" she asked solemnly. "You bet we have," piped Davy cheerfully, quite in his own man again. "I wasn't a bit scared either. Only just at first. It come on a fella so sudden, I made up my mind quick as a wink that I wouldn't fight Teddy Sloan Monday, as I'd promised, but now maybe I will. Say, Dora, was you scared?" "Yes, I was a little scared," said Dora primly, "but I held tight to Anne's hand and said my prayers over and over again." "Well, I'd have said my prayers too if I'd have thought of it," said Davy, "but," he added triumphantly, "you see I came through just as safe as you for all, and I didn't say them." Anne got Marilla a glassful of her potent currant wine. How potent it was, Anne, in her earlier days, had all too good reason to know, and then they went to the door to look out on the strange scene. Far and wide was a white carpet, knee-deep of hailstones. Drifts of them were heaped up under the eaves and on the steps. When 3 or 4 days later those hailstones melted, the havoc they had wrought was plainly seen. For every green growing thing in field or garden was cut off. Not only was every blossom stripped from the apple trees, but great boughs and branches were wrenched away, and out of the 200 trees set out by the improvers, by far the greater number were snapped off or torn to shreds. "Can it possibly be the same world it was an hour ago?" said Anne dazedly. "It must have taken longer than that to play such havoc." "The like of this has never been known in Prince Edward Island," said Marilla. "Never. I remember when I was a girl there was a bad storm, but it was nothing to this. We'll hear of terrible destruction, you may be sure." "I do hope none of the children were caught out in it," murmured Anne anxiously. As it was discovered later, none of the children had been, since all those who had any distance to go had taken Mr. Andrews' excellent advice and sought refuge at the post office. "There comes John Henry Carter," said Marilla. John Henry came wading through the hailstones with a rather scared grin. "Oh, ain't this awful, Miss Cuthbert? Mr. Harrison sent me over to see if yous had come out all right." "We've none of us killed," said Marilla grimly. "And none of the buildings was struck. I hope you got off equally well." "Yes'm, not quite so well, ma'am. We was struck. The lightning knocked over the kitchen chimbley and come down the flue and knocked over Ginger's cage and tore a hole in the floor and went into the cellar. Yes'm." "Was Ginger hurt?" queried Anne. "Yes'm. He was hurt pretty bad. He was killed." Later on, Anne went over to comfort Mr. Harrison. She found him sitting by the table stroking Ginger's gay dead body with a trembling hand. "Poor Ginger won't call you any more names, Anne," he said mournfully. Anne could never have imagined herself crying on Ginger's account, but the tears came to her eyes. "He was all the company I had, Anne, and now he's dead." Well, well, I'm an old fool to care so much. I let on I don't care. I know you're going to say something sympathetic as soon as I stop talking, but don't. If you did, I'd cry like a baby. Hasn't this been a terrible storm? I guess folks won't laugh at Uncle Abe's predictions again. Seems as if all the storms that he's been prophesying all his life that never happened came all at once. Beats all how he struck the very day, though, don't it? Look at the mess we have here. I must hustle round and get some boards to patch up that hole in the floor." Avonlea folks did nothing the next day but visit each other and compare damages. The roads were impassable for wheels by reason of the hailstones, so they walked or rode on horseback. The mail came late with ill tidings from all over the Providence. Houses had been struck, people killed and injured, the whole telephone and telegraph system had been disorganized, and any number of young stock exposed in the fields had perished. Uncle Abe waded out to the blacksmith's forge early in the morning and spent the whole day there. It was Uncle Abe's hour of triumph, and he enjoyed it to the full. It would be doing Uncle Abe an injustice to say that he was glad the storm had happened. But since it had to be, he was very glad he had predicted it, to the very day, too. Uncle Abe forgot that he had never denied setting the day. As for the trifling discrepancy in the hour, that was nothing. Gilbert arrived at Green Gables in the evening and found Marilla and Anne busily engaged in nailing strips of oilcloth over the broken windows. "Goodness only knows when we'll get glass for them," said Marilla. "Mr. Barry went over to Cromarty this afternoon, but not a pane could he get for love or money. Lawson and Blair were cleaned out by the Cromarty people by 10 o'clock. Was the storm bad at White Sands, Gilbert?" "I should say so. I was caught in the school with all the children, and I thought some of them would go mad with fright. 3 of them fainted, and 2 girls took hysterics, and Tommy Blewett did nothing but shriek at the top of his voice the whole time." "I only squealed once," said Davy proudly. "My garden was all smashed flat," he continued mournfully. "But so was Dora's," he added in a tone which indicated that there was yet balm in Gilead. Anne came running down from the west gable. "Oh, Gilbert, have you heard the news? Mr. Levi Bolter's old house was struck and burned to the ground. It seems to me that I'm dreadfully wicked to feel glad over that, when so much damage has been done. Mr. Bolter says he believes the AVIS magicked up that storm on purpose." "Well, one thing is certain," said Gilbert, laughing. "A Zerber has made Uncle Abe's reputation as a weather prophet. Uncle Abe's storm will go down in local history. It is a most extraordinary coincidence that it should have come on the very day we selected. I actually have a half-guilty feeling as if I really had magicked it up. We may as well rejoice over the old house being removed, for there's not much to rejoice over where our young trees are concerned. Not 10 of them have escaped." "Ah, well, we'll just have to plant them over again next spring," said Anne philosophically. "That is one good thing about this world. There are always sure to be more springs." An Avonlea scandal. One blithe June morning, a fortnight after Uncle Abe's storm, Anne came slowly through the Green Gables yard from the garden, carrying in her hands 2 blighted stalks of white narcissus. "Look, Marilla," she said sorrowfully, holding up the flowers before the eyes of a grim lady, with her hair coiffed in a green gingham apron, who was going into the house with a plucked chicken. "These are the only buds the storm spared, and even they are imperfect. I'm so sorry. I wanted some for Matthew's grave. He was always so fond of June lilies." "I kind of miss them myself," admitted Marilla, "though it doesn't seem right to lament over them when so many worse things have happened, all the crops destroyed as well as the fruit." "But people have sown their oats over again," said Anne comfortingly, "and Mr. Harrison says he thinks if we have a good summer they'll come out all right though late. And my annuals are all coming up again, but oh, nothing can replace the June lilies. Poor little Hester Gray will have none either. I went all the way back to her garden last, but there wasn't one. I'm sure she'll miss them." "I don't think it's right for you to say such things, Anne. I really don't," said Marilla severely. "Hester Gray has been dead for 30 years, and her spirit is in heaven, I hope." "Yes, but I believe she loves and remembers her garden here still," said Anne. "I'm sure no matter how long I lived in heaven, I'd like to look down and see somebody putting flowers on my grave. If I had a garden here like Hester Gray, it would take me more than 30 years, even in heaven, to forget being homesick for it by spells." "Well, don't let the twins hear you talking like that," was Marilla's feeble protest, as she carried her chicken into the house. Anne pinned her narcissus on her hair and went to the lane gate, where she stood for a while sunning herself in the June brightness before going in to attend to her Saturday morning duties. The world was growing lovely again. Old Mother Nature was doing her best to remove the traces of the storm, and though she was not to succeed fully for many a moon, she was really accomplishing wonders. I wish I could just be idle all day today, Anne told a bluebird who was singing and swinging on a willow bough. But a schoolma'am, who also is helping to bring up twins, can't indulge in laziness. Birdie, how sweet you are singing, little bird. You are just putting the feelings of my heart into song ever so much better than I could myself. Why, who is coming? An express wagon was jolting up the lane with 2 people on the front seat and a big trunk behind. When it drew near, Anne recognized the driver as the son of the station agent at Bright River, but his companion was a stranger. A scrap of a woman who sprang nimbly down at the gate almost before the horse came to a standstill. She was a very pretty little person, evidently nearer 50 than 40, but with rosy cheeks, sparkling black eyes, and shiny black hair, surmounted by a wonderful beflowered and beflumed bonnet. In spite of having driven 8 miles over a dusty road, she was as neat as if she had just stepped out of the proverbial bandbox. "Is this where Mr. James A. Harrison lives?" she inquired briskly. "No, Mr. Harrison lives over there," said Anne, quite lost in astonishment. "Well, I did think this place seemed too tidy, much too tidy for James A. to be living here, unless he has greatly changed since I knew him," chirped the little lady. "Is it true that James A. is going to be married to some woman living in this settlement?" "No, oh no," cried Anne, flushing so guiltily that the stranger looked curiously at her as if she half suspected her of matrimonial designs on Mr. Harrison. "But I saw it in an island paper," persisted the fair unknown. "A friend sent a marked copy to me. Friends are always so ready to do such things. James A.'s name was written in over New Citizen." "Oh, that note was only meant as a joke," gasped Anne. "Mr. Harrison has no intention of marrying anybody. I assure you he hasn't." "I'm very glad to hear it," said the rosy lady, climbing nimbly back to her seat in the wagon, "because he happens to be married already. I am his wife." "Oh, you may well look surprised. I suppose he's been masquerading as a bachelor and breaking hearts right and left. Well, well, James A., nodding vigorously over the fields at the long white house, "your fun is over. I am here, though I wouldn't have bothered coming if I hadn't thought you were up to some mischief. I suppose," turning to Anne, "that parrot of his is as profane as ever." His parrot is dead, I think," gasped poor Anne, who couldn't have felt sure of her own name at that precise moment. "Dead? Everything will be all right then," cried the rosy lady jubilantly. "I can manage James A. if that bird is out of the way." With which cryptic utterance she went joyfully on her way, and Anne flew to the kitchen door to meet Marilla. "Anne, who was that woman?" "Marilla," said Anne solemnly, but with dancing eyes. "Do I look as if I were crazy?" "Not more so than usual," said Marilla, with no thought of being sarcastic. "Well, then, do you think I am awake?" "Anne, what nonsense has got into you? Who was that woman, I say?" "Marilla, if I'm not crazy and not asleep, she can't be such stuff as dreams are made of. She must be real. Anyway, I'm sure I couldn't imagine such a bonnet. She says she's Mr. Harrison's wife, Marilla." Marilla stared in her turn. "His wife? Anne Shirley! Then what has he been passing himself off as an unmarried man for?" "I don't suppose he did, really," said Anne, trying to be just. "He never said he wasn't married. People simply took it for granted. Oh, Marilla, what will Miss Lynde say to this?" They found out what Miss Lynde had to say when she came up that evening. Miss Lynde wasn't surprised. Miss Lynde had always expected something of the sort. Miss Lynde had always known there was something about Mr. Harrison. "To think of him deserting his wife," she said indignantly. "It's like something you'd read of in the States, but who would expect such a thing to happen right here in Avonlea?" "But we don't know that he deserted her," protested Anne, determined to believe her friend innocent till he was proven guilty. "We don't know the rights of it all." "Well, we soon will. I'm going straight over there," said Miss Lynde, who had never learned that there was such a word as delicacy in the dictionary. I'm not supposed to know anything about her arrival, and Mr. Harrison was to bring some medicine for Thomas from Cromarty today, so that will be a good excuse. I'll find out the whole story, and I'll come in and tell you on my way back." Miss Lynde rushed in when Anne had feared to tread. Nothing would have induced the latter to go over to the Harrison place, but she had her natural and proper share of curiosity, and she felt secretly glad that Miss Lynde was going to solve the mystery. She and Marilla waited expectantly for that good lady's return, but waited in vain. Miss Lynde did not revisit Green Gables that night. Davy, arriving home at 9 o'clock from the Boulter place, explained why. "I met Miss Lynde and some strange woman in the hollow," he said, and gracious, how they were talking both at once. "Miss Lynde said to tell you she was sorry it was too late to call tonight, Anne. I'm awful hungry. We had tea at Milty's at 4, and I think Mrs. Boulter is real mean. She didn't give us any preserves or cake, and even the bread was scarce." "Davy, when you go visiting, you must never criticize anything you're given to eat," said Anne solemnly. "It is very bad manners." "All right, I'll only think it," said Davy cheerfully. "Do give a fellow some supper, Anne." Anne looked at Marilla, who followed her into the pantry and shut the door cautiously. "You can give him some jam on his bread, Anne. I know what tea at Levi Boulter's is apt to be." Davy took his slice of bread and jam with a sigh. "It's kind of disappointing world after all," he remarked. "Milty has a cat that takes fits. She took a fit regular every day for 3 weeks. Milty says it's awful fun to watch her. I went down today on purpose to see her have one, but that mean old thing wouldn't take a fit and just kept healthy as healthy. Though Milty and me hung around all afternoon and waited, but never mind." Davy brightened up as the insidious comfort of the plum jam stole into his soul. "Maybe I'll see her in one sometime yet. It doesn't seem likely she'd stop having them all at once when she's been so in the habit of it, does it? This jam is awful nice." Davy had no sorrows that plum jam could not cure. Sunday proved so rainy that there was no stirring abroad, but by Monday everybody had heard some version of the Harrison story. The school buzzed with it, and Davy came home full of information. "Marilla, Mr. Harrison has a new wife. Well, not exactly new, but they've stopped being married for quite a spell, Milty says. I always supposed people had to keep on being married once they begun, but Milty says no, there's ways of stopping it if you can't agree. Milty says one way is to just start off and leave your wife. And that's what Mr. Harrison did. Milty says Mr. Harrison left his wife because she throwed things at him, hard things. And Artie Sloane says it was because she wouldn't let him smoke, and Ned Clay says it was because she never let up scolding him. I wouldn't leave my wife for anything like that. I'd just put my foot down and say, 'Miss Davy, you just got to do what'll please me 'cause I'm a man,' and that'll settle her pretty quick, I guess." But Annetta Clay says she left him because he wouldn't scrape his boots at the door, and she doesn't blame her. I'm going right over to Mr. Harrison's this minute to see what she likes." Davy soon returned, somewhat cast down. "Mrs. Harrison was away. She's gone to Cromarty with Miss Rachel Lynde to get new paper for the parlor. And Mr. Harrison said to tell Anne to go over and see him because he wants to have a talk with her. And say the floor is scrubbed and Mr. Harrison is shaved, though there wasn't any preaching yesterday." The Harrison kitchen wore a very unfamiliar look to Anne. The floor was indeed scrubbed to a wonderful pitch of purity, and so was every article of furniture in the room. The stove was polished until she could see her face in it. The walls were whitewashed, and the window panes sparkled in the sunlight. By the table sat Mr. Harrison in his working clothes, which on Friday had been noted for sundry rents and tatters, but which were now neatly patched and brushed. He was sprucely shaved, and what little hair he had was carefully trimmed. "Sit down, Anne. Sit down," Mr. Harrison said in a tone but 2 degrees removed from that which Avonlea people used at funerals. "Emily's gone over to Cromarty with Rachel Lynde. She's struck up a lifelong friendship already with Rachel Lynde. Beats all how contrary women are. Well, Anne, my easy times are over. All over. It's neatness and tidiness for me for the rest of my natural life, I suppose." Mr. Harrison did his best to speak dolefully, but an irrepressible twinkle in his eye betrayed him. "Mr. Harrison, "You're glad your wife has come back," cried Anne, shaking her finger at him. "You needn't pretend you're not, because I can see it plainly." Mr. Harrison relaxed into a sheepish smile. Well, I'm getting used to it," he conceded. "I can't say I was sorry to see Emily. A man really needs some protection in a community like this, where he can't play a game of checkers with a neighbor without being accused of wanting to marry that neighbor's sister and having it put in the paper. Nobody could have supposed you went to see Isabella Andrews if you hadn't pretended to be unmarried," said Anne severely. "I didn't pretend I was. If anybody had asked me if I was married, I would have said I was, but they just took it for granted. I wasn't anxious to talk about the matter. I was feeling too sore over it. It would have been nuts for Miss Rachel Lynde if she had known my wife had left me, wouldn't it now? But some people say that you left her." "She started it, Anne. She started it. I'm going to tell you the whole story, for I don't want you to think worse of me than I deserve, nor of Emily either. But let's go out to the veranda. Everything is so fearful neat in here that it kind of makes me homesick. I suppose I'll get used to it after a while, but it eases me to look up at the yard. Emily hasn't had time to tidy it up yet." As soon as they were comfortably seated on the veranda, Mr. Harrison began his tale of woe. "I lived in Scottsford, New Brunswick, before I came here, Anne. My sister kept house for me, and she suited me fine. She was just reasonably tidy, and she left 3 years ago. And she left me alone and spoiled me, so Emily says. But 3 years ago she died, and before she died she worried a lot about what was to become of me, and finally she got me to promise I'd get married. She advised me to take Emily Scott because Emily had money of her own and was a pattern housekeeper. I says I, Emily Scott wouldn't look at me. You ask her and see, says my sister, and just to ease her mind, I promised her I would, and I did. And Emily said she'd have me. Never was so surprised in my life, Anne. A smart, pretty little woman like her and an old fellow like me. I tell you, I thought at first I was in luck. Well, we were married, and we took a little wedding trip up to St. John for a fortnight, and then we went home. We got home at 10 o'clock at night, and I give you my word, Anne, that in half an hour that woman was at work house cleaning. Oh, I know you're thinking my house needed it. You've got a very expressive face, Anne. Your thoughts just come out of it like a print. But it didn't, not that bad. It got pretty mixed up while I was keeping bachelor's hall, I admit, but I got a woman to come in and clean it up before I was married, and there'd been considerable painting and fixing done. I tell you, if you took Emily into a brand new white marble palace, she'd be into scrubbing as soon as she could get an old dress on. Well, she cleaned house till 1 o'clock that night, and at 4 she was up and at it again, and she kept on that way. Far as I could see, she never did stop. It was scour and sweep and dust everlasting, except on Sundays. And then she was just longing for money to begin again. But it was her way of amusing herself, and I could have reconciled myself to it if she left me alone. But that she wouldn't do. She set out to make me over, but she had caught me young enough. I wasn't allowed to come into the house unless I changed my boots for slippers at the door. I darsn't smoke a pipe for my life unless I went to the barn. And I didn't use good enough grammar. Emily had been a schoolteacher in her early life, and she'd never got over it. Then she hated to see me eating with my knife. Well, there it was, pick and nag everlasting. But I suppose, Anne, to be fair, I was cantankerous too. I didn't try to improve as I might have done. I just got cranky and disagreeable when she found fault. I told her one day she hadn't complained of my grammar when I proposed to her. It wasn't an overly tactful thing to say. A woman would forgive a man for beating her sooner than for hinting she was too much pleased to get him. Well, we bickered along like that, and it wasn't exactly pleasant, but we might have got used to each other after a spell if it hadn't been for Ginger. Ginger was the rock we split on at last. Emily didn't like parrots, and she couldn't stand Ginger's profane habits of speech. I was attached to the bird for my brother the sailor's sake. My brother the sailor was a pet of mine when we were little tads, and he'd sent Ginger to me when he was dying. I didn't see any sense in getting worked up over his swearing. There's nothing I hate worse than profanity in a human being, but in a parrot, that's just repeating what it's heard with no more understanding of it than I'd have of Chinese allowances might be made. But Emily couldn't see it that way. Women ain't logical. She tried to break Ginger of swearing, but she hadn't any better success than she had in trying to make me stop saying I seen and them things. Seemed as if the more she tried, the worse Ginger got, same as me. Well, things went on like this, both of us getting raspier till the climax came. Emily invited our minister and his wife to tea, and another minister and his wife that was visiting them. I promised to put Ginger away in some safe place where nobody would hear him. Emily wouldn't touch his cage with a 10-foot pole, and I meant to do it, for I didn't want the ministers to hear anything unpleasant in my house. But it slipped my mind. Emily was worrying me so much about clean collars and grammars that it wasn't any wonder, and I never thought of that poor parrot till we sat down to tea. And just as the minister number one was in the very middle of saying grace, Ginger, who was on the veranda outside the dining room window, lifted up his voice. The gobbler had come into view in the yard, and the sight of a gobbler always had an unwholesome effect on Ginger. He surpassed himself that time. You can smile, Anne, and I don't deny I've chuckled some over it since myself, but at that time I felt almost as much mortified as Emily. I went out and carried Ginger to the barn. I can't say I enjoyed that meal. I knew by the look of Emily that there was trouble brewing for Ginger and James A. When the folks went away, I started for the cow pasture, and on the way, I did some thinking. I felt sorry for Emily and kind of fancied I hadn't been so thoughtful of her as I might. And besides, I wondered if the ministers would think that Ginger had learned his vocabulary from me. The long and short of it was, I decided that Ginger would have to be mercifully disposed of, and when I drove the cows home, I went in to tell Emily so. But there was no Emily, and there was a letter on the table. Just according to the rule in storybooks. Emily writ that I have to choose between her and Ginger. She'd gone back to her own house, and there she would stay till I went and told her I'd get rid of that parrot. I was all riled up, Anne, and I said she might stay till doomsday if she waited for that, and I stuck to it. I packed up her belongings, and I sent them after her. It made an awful lot of talk. Scottsford was pretty near as bad as Avonlea for gossip, and everybody sympathized with Emily. It kept me all cross and cantankerous, and I saw I'd have to get out or I'd never have any peace. I concluded I'd come to the island. I've been here when I was a boy, and I liked it, but Emily had always said she wouldn't live in a place where folks were scared to walk out after dark for fear they'd fall off the edge. So, just to be contrary, I moved over here, and that's all there is to it. I had never heard a word from or about Emily till I come home from the backfield Saturday and found her scrubbing the floor, but with the first decent dinner I'd had since she left me already on the table. She told me to eat first, and then we'd talk, by which I concluded that Emily had learned some lessons about getting along with a man. So she's here, and she's going to stay, seeing that Ginger's dead and the island's some bigger than she thought. There's Miss Lind and her now. No, don't go, Anne. Stay and get acquainted with Emily. She took quite a notion to you Saturday. Wanted to know who that handsome red-headed girl was at the next house. Miss Harrison welcomed Anne radiantly and insisted on her staying to tea. James A. has been telling me all about you and how kind you've been making cakes and things for him, she said. I want to get acquainted with all my new neighbors just as soon as possible. Miss Lind is a lovely woman, isn't she? So friendly. When Anne went home in the sweet June dusk, Mrs. Harrison went with her across the fields where the fireflies were lighting their starry lamps. I suppose, said Miss Harrison confidentially, that James A. has told you our story. Yes. Then I needn't tell it, for James A. is a just man, and he would tell the truth. The blame was far from being all on his side. I can see that now. I wasn't back in my own house an hour before I wished I hadn't been so hasty, but I wouldn't give in. I see now that I expected too much of a man, and I was real foolish to mind his bad grammar. It doesn't matter if a man does use bad grammar so long as he's a good provider and doesn't go poking around the pantry to see how much sugar you've used in a week. I feel that James A. and I are going to be real happy now. I wish I knew who Observer is so that I could thank him. I owe him a real debt of gratitude. Anne kept her own counsel, and Mrs. Harrison never knew that her gratitude found its way to its object. Anne felt rather bewildered over the far-reaching consequences of those foolish notes. They had reconciled a man to his wife and made the reputation of a prophet. Miss Lynn was in the Green Gables kitchen. She had been telling the whole story to Marilla. "Well, and how do you like Mrs. Harrison?" she asked Anne. "Very much. I think she's a real nice little woman." "That's exactly what she is," said Miss Rachel with emphasis. And as I've just been saying to Marilla, I think we ought to all overlook Mr. Harrison's peculiarities for her sake and try to make her feel at home here. That's what. Well, I must get back. Thomas will be worrying for me. I'll get out a little since Eliza came, and he seems a lot better these past few days, but I never like to be a long way from him. I hear Gilbert Blythe has resigned from White Sands. He'll be off to college in the fall, I suppose. Miss Rachel looked sharply at Anne, but Anne was bending over a sleepy Davy nodding on the sofa, and nothing was to be read in her face. She carried Davy away, her oval, girlish cheeks pressed against his curly yellow head. As they went up the stairs, Davy flung a tired arm around Anne's neck and gave her a warm hug and a sticky kiss. "You're awful nice, Anne. Milty Boulter wrote on his slate today and showed it to Jeannie Sloane. Roses red and violets blue, sugar sweet, and so are you. And that expresses my feelings for you exactly, Anne." Well, thank you for joining me for this storybook adventure. I hope you enjoyed this reading of these 2 chapters. I look forward to being here with you next week as we continue reading Anne of Avonlea. Until then, be joyful, my friends. Stay crafty in your own way. Make your own joyful creation. Nugs and joy.